We are continuing in our series this morning on love and sex and relationships. We have had some good conversations so far. They've been challenging, a bit vulnerable. And today we are going to step into another vulnerable space, and that is talking about men and what we as men bring or don't bring into this realm of love and relationships. And more specifically, we're going to be talking about our hearts, the hearts of men. And we're going to be doing so by looking at a couple of characters, a couple of leaders from the older section of the Bible in a book called First Samuel. And so I would encourage you, I'm going to be kind of skipping through First Samuel. It is found towards the beginning of your Bibles. It comes right after Ruth. And it is found, the first page of it, 1 Samuel chapter 1 is found on page 338. So I'd encourage you to find a Bible, and we're going to kind of walk through this relationship between a couple of lead characters in the Old Testament who are introduced here in this book, David and Saul. Now, 1 Samuel is called Samuel because it is named after the prophet, the judge, the man after God's heart. His name was Samuel. If you don't remember, the people of Israel, as they came out of Egypt, became a people in the land that God had given to them. Initially, they did not have a king. Theirs was to be a theocracy. They were to follow after God. And one of God's prophets or judges was to lead them, and that's what happened for a while. These leaders who would talk to God, had an intimate relationship with God, would then share the will of God and the ways of God with the people, and they would do their best to follow after. But Samuel, and he was one of these judges, one of these prophets, one of these leaders, and he was a good one. As he got older, it was apparent that his sons were kind of not following in his footsteps. And that there wasn't someone from his lineage that could take over. And so the people of Israel, as Samuel got older, said this to him in chapter 8. They said, "Hey, you're getting old. And your sons, it's not working there. And so this is what we would like you to do, Samuel. Before you die, we want you to appoint for us a king to lead us like the other nations. This is what's going on. Other nations around us, whether it was the Edomites or it was the Amalekites, the Moabites, they've got kings. We want to be like them. So anoint for us a king." And so Samuel goes to God with this, and God reluctantly says, "Okay." And so God has Samuel go to the tribe of the Benjamites. It's one of the interesting things that we find throughout the scriptures, especially the Old Testament, is when God is going to find someone to do something through, God tends to go places that we wouldn't typically go. And God finds, and Samuel finds Saul in the smallest family, in the smallest tribe of Israel. They're Benjamites, and not a lot happened to the tribe of Benjamin, but God says, this tribe that you overlook, this small family within that tribe, that is where I'm going to find my leader. And so that's what God does. He sends Samuel to the tribe of Benjamin, and as he meets with the people there, he determines that it is going to be Saul. And so Saul and Samuel begin a relationship. It's interesting to watch the trajectory of Saul's life. It's actually a brief time that he is kind of in the favor of God, and he does rule for some time, but the latter half of his rule is not a successful one. And the way that as I've been reading through 1 Samuel again the last week, the way that I now interpret and understand Saul is that I believe that God had more in store for Saul. That if Saul had learned a couple of lessons and dealt with some of the pain, the depression, the tragedy in his life in a different way, perhaps he could have been a better leader. Perhaps his rule could have been longer. The way that God worked in him and worked through his heart could have been more productive. But alas, that was not to be the case. There was a couple of decisions that Saul made early on in his reign as king, and he chose to do some things that he probably shouldn't have. He took control over times when he was not supposed to take control, and so God tells Samuel, listen, I am I'm going to choose somebody else. Saul has strayed from me. And so God says this in chapter 10. Oh, this is a good part. I'm sorry, I'm going to back up. This is still good. This is when things are going well with Saul. When Saul meets Samuel, it's this interesting line that comes in chapter 10, that as Samuel and Saul are having a conversation, and Samuel is saying to this Saul, who's a young man, God is going to make you king. Saul is doesn't know kind of what to make of this, and as he's leaving Samuel in this conversation with Samuel, it says this. It says that God gave Saul a different heart. God gave this new leader a new heart, as the saying goes, a heart after God's own heart, filled with passion and love and longing and pain, all those things that make good leaders. His heart, Saul's was connected to God before it started to get unconnected. Another interesting passage from Saul, or 1 Samuel chapter 10, that tells you a little bit more about this young man, Samuel, or the young man Saul. I apologize, I keep confusing those names. When Samuel brought all of the tribes of Israel together to anoint Saul as their new king, this is a new thing, so he got everybody together. This is the story that is told. Then Samuel brought all of the Israelite tribes together, and Saul, Kish's son, was selected as king. But when they looked for him, he wasn't to be found. So they asked another question of the Lord, has the man come here yet? And the Lord said, yes, he's hiding among the supplies. So they ran and they retrieved Saul from there. And when he stood up in the middle of the people, he was head and shoulders taller than everyone else. And he doesn't say anything, but Samuel says, can you see the one who the Lord has chosen? And of course they could, because he was tall. And the people said, Samuel said, he has no equal among the people. And then all the people shouted, say it with me, long live the king. I think just even in this passage, as I read through it a couple of times, I thought about what happens to men in our society. What happens to boys, right? At some stage in the young adult life, you are told it's time to step up. You're the man. And whether somebody tells us exactly what it means to be the man or not, we figure it out. And what it means is that little part of you that is insecure or scared, that is hiding, you don't show anybody that, kid, right? You stand up and you, whether you are tall or not, you try your best to be head and shoulders above everyone else. Because when you can do that, when you can deny your insecurities and your fears, and you can stand up and you can be the man, then other people will say to you, hail the king. And whether you feel like a king, whether you feel like you should be in that position or not, it doesn't really matter, because that is projected upon you. And you start to take on, to the extent that you can, that identity, and you leave the hiding, insecure boy behind. So Saul is anointed as king, but regretfully had a way of not listening to God or Samuel. He promoted himself in various ways, and his heart, his spirit, became troubled. And then the text says that he fell out of favor with God. And so in chapter 13, we learn that God says to Samuel, I want you to search out and find another man who will follow the Lord's own mind. No, follow the Lord's strength. No, what does it say? Follow the Lord's heart. Find a man who can follow after the Lord's heart. This seems to be the consistent heartbeat of God, looking for a man who has a heart, who's in touch with his heart, and can follow after God's own heart. And I will commission him as a leader of the people. And so then God sent Samuel to Bethlehem to find and anoint the one who would succeed Saul as king of Israel. one whose heart would be aligned with God's, whose character would be like God's. And so I want us to turn now to chapter 16. It's a great chapter, and I'm going to read it all the way through. And as we do, we're going to talk about these two men. 1 Samuel chapter 16 begins with Samuel kind of reluctantly going to find this new leader, this new person who will be king, and having a little bit of a discussion with God about it along the way. So 1 Samuel chapter 16, the Lord said to Samuel, how long are you going to grieve over Saul, right? I've rejected him as king over Israel. Now fill your horn with oil and get going. I'm sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem because I have found my next king among his sons. How can I do that? Samuel asked. When Saul hears of it, he'll kill me. Well, God comes up with a little scheme, says, take a heifer with you, the Lord replied, and say, I have come to make a sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, that's David's dad, and I will make clear to you what you should do. You will anoint for me the person that I point out to you. So Samuel says, okay. So Samuel shows up to Bethlehem. He did what the Lord instructed. And when he came to Bethlehem, the city elders came to meet him, and they were shaking with fear because this was Saul's right-hand man. Do you come in peace? They asked. Yes, Samuel answered. I have come to make a sacrifice to the Lord. See, here's my heifer. Now, make yourselves holy and come with me to the sacrifice. So Samuel made Jesse and his sons holy and invited them to the sacrifice as well. So they just went through ritual cleaning and made themselves ready for the sacrifice. When they arrived, Samuel looked at Eliab. Now, here's a cute little picture from a children's Bible. Here is Samuel seated, and that is the Levi, and that is his children who are lining up there. And so as Samuel is sitting and is listening to the dad talk about all of his sons, Jesse says, come here, take a look at my boys. And as Samuel is there taking a look at the many children that are presented to him, that Jesse presents to him, he says this, that must be the one. Eliab, there, that is the Lord's anointed. Right there, the guy in the front. But then the Lord said to Samuel, this is a great quote, have no regard for his appearance or his stature, because I haven't selected him. God doesn't look at things like humans do. God sees only, or humans see only what is visible to the eyes. But the Lord sees into what? The heart. Next, Jesse called for Abinadab, who presented himself to Samuel, but he said, the Lord hasn't chosen this one either. So Jesse presented Shammah, but Samuel said, no, the Lord hasn't chosen this one either. And Jesse presented 7 of his sons to Samuel. But Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord hasn't picked any of these. Then Samuel said to Jesse, is that all your boys? And he said, nope, there's actually still a youngest one, but he's out keeping the sheep. Send for him, Samuel told Jesse, because we can't proceed until he gets here. And so Jesse sent and brought him in. He was reddish brown. It's good to remember that the people in the Bible had brown skin. David had reddish brown skin, beautiful eyes. He was good looking. See, even the commentator can't stop himself. We like to look at the things on the outside, right, and comment at those. But the Lord said, that's the one. I want you to anoint him. So Samuel took the horn of oil, and he anointed David right there in front of his brothers. And the Lord's Spirit came over David from that time forward. And so even though we want to choose the biggest one, the strongest one, the tallest one, God chooses the little guy with the brown skin and says, you're the one who's going to lead us. Now, the Lord's Spirit had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. And Saul's servants said, look, an evil spirit of the Lord of God is tormenting you. Now, let me just pause right there. If you do a Google search for some of the most confusing, troubling, difficult passages in the Bible theologically, this is one of the ones that comes up. I mean, think about it. We've talked about when you read the Bible, you have to understand that you are reading it in context. It was written at a certain time by a certain type of people and a certain type of culture. And then we also talked about a couple of weeks ago how whenever we read the Scriptures, we need to do so through the lens of Christ, right? The fullest revelation of God to us is in Christ. And so if we read anything in the Bible that is kind of out of line with what we've learned of who God is and God's heart in Christ, then it's okay for us to kind of challenge that and ask a question, so what's that all about? This would be one of those times. So God removed God's spirit from Saul and sent an evil spirit to torment him. Does that sound like your God? I mean, if so, that's kind of weird, right? And so most scholars have tried to figure this out, and probably, again, what is happening is you've got a time and a place where people don't have names for or words for things like clinical or deep depression or anxiety attacks and these. So clearly Saul goes through something, and he's having a dark night of the soul. He's depressed. He's angry. He can't get out of bed. And so what is kind of written into the text here is that God has sent another spirit to torment him. I looked at various translations of 1 Samuel, and I think the New Living Translation uses a dynamic equivalent sort of translation from the Hebrew, and it gets more at the idea behind this text. And it puts it like this. It says, "Now the Spirit of the Lord left Saul, and the Lord sent instead a spirit that filled him with depression and fear." Saul was depressed. He was sad. He was fearful. So let's get back to the text. Verse 18 or 17. "So Saul, in this depressed state, says to his servants, 'Find me a good musician and bring him to me.' And one of the servants responded, 'I know that one of Jesse's sons from Bethlehem is a good musician. He's a strong man and heroic, a warrior who speaks well, and he's good looking. The Lord Yahweh is with him.' So Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, 'Send me your son David, the one who keeps the sheep.' So this little guy gets taken away from his home and brought to the palace. Jesse then took a donkey and loaded it with an omer of bread and a jar of wine and a young goat, and he sent it along with his son David to Saul. And this is how David came to Saul and entered into his servant. Saul liked David very much, and David became his armor bearer." This kind of leads us into the next chapter where, if you know your David and Saul history, Saul goes into battle against the Philistines, and one particular Philistine is giving them a lot of trouble, whose name is Goliath. And David follows Saul there as his armor bearer, and David ends up stepping into the line of battle without Saul's armor, but with a slingshot, and takes down Goliath, and begin then the rise of David as a leader in Saul's palace. So David became Saul's armor bearer, and Saul sent a message to Jesse, "Please allow David to remain in my service because I'm pleased with him." And whenever the evil spirit from God affected Saul, David would take the lyre and he would play it. He'd play the guitar, the harp. And most likely he sang, because you know that most of the Psalms in our Bible were written by David. Actually, the hymns that we will read, that we'll sing, all three today, were written by David. He was a musician, talented. So David would take the lyre and he would play it in Saul's presence, and Saul would relax and feel better, and the evil spirit would leave him alone. I think this passage, and thinking about David and Saul, kind of reveals to us in stark contrast the vast possibilities on this male spectrum of ours, right? You have men who are humble, men who are creative, men who can lead from a place of deep strength and wisdom, men who can express and experience their desire, their frustration, their resiliency, their intelligence, all good things that men can bring into leadership, into community, into relationships, into a family. Men can be a gift. And men can be the worst, right? Distant, egotistical, self-centered, lustful. Men have a way of objectifying other people. Men can be emotionally stunted, seemingly uncaring, even violent. And my guess is that we all in this room have experienced men along that spectrum, men that have meant the world to us and have shown us what it means to love and to lead and to serve and to care, and men who have shown the worst to us, and we probably still bear the wounds because of it. But what about those men of us who want to be better? What about those men of us who want to be men after God's own heart? What do we do? I think the stories of Saul and David point to the answer, and it points directly to our hearts. Right? God anoints Saul and changes Saul's heart. When Saul loses track of God's leading, gets unconnected from God's heart, his spirit is troubled, and God seeks another man then after his own heart. In the New Testament, in the call to worship that we read together this morning, 1,000 years later, Luke is writing in Acts about the story of David, and what it is that Luke lifts up there is that David was one who had a heart like God's, and through David's lineage came Jesus, who made God's heart known to the world. There is a through line here. If you want to be a good man, have a heart that is open to God. That's what God calls for. And yet the basic gender imperative of my life, of our society, is that girls are raised to be nice and boys are raised to be tough. Be a man. We all know what that means, and how you were told to be, and what you were told to do, and what you were told not to be. Don't be a fill in the blank, right? One of the ways that boys learn to be tough is that at a young age, we shut off. We begin to not listen to, or at least open our hearts. It's too vulnerable. Psychologist John Gottman says that if you look back in history millennia ago, when men were the bigger and stronger gender in a tribe that lived in the dangers of the wild, it was beneficial when a saber-toothed tiger or an invading tribe came into the camp that men were taught to shut down their fears, shut down their insecurities, shut down their shame, shut down their indecision, and be resolute and be physical. It served the tribe well. But in today's age, when we are not attacked by saber-toothed tigers, we men still tend to draw from the same toolbox and respond to challenges in the same way. The messages that we receive as men in society teaches us early to cut off our relationships with the vulnerable, emotional parts of who we are. We literally cut off the connection to our hearts when God is looking for a man who is connected to his heart and is after God's own heart. It's a conundrum. It's a challenge we men face, but it's our challenge. Someone who has studied and focused on male spirituality and the male heart and the challenges that men work through as trying to be spiritual people is a Franciscan priest named Richard Rohr. You've probably heard me talk about Rohr before. He is one of my favorite theologians. As I was reading through this story of David and Saul and about their hearts and the trouble that Saul went through and the troubles that David would go through later in his life, I thought about a quote of Rohr's that I read. It says, "When positive masculine energy is not modeled for our boys, it creates vacuums in the souls of men, and into that vacuum demons pour." For 14 years, Rohr worked as a chaplain at a state penitentiary. And he said he honestly couldn't think of a young man that he worked with in the penitentiary, in the prison system, who had a good and positive, loving relationship with his father. Demons pour in. How do we men change? How do we exorcise those demons? Because the fact of the matter is, it is a trauma that we tend to pass down from one generation to the next. My father was distant, therefore I will be distant. My father was abusive, therefore I will be abusive. My father was cut off from his own heart, therefore I have cut off from my own heart, and therefore I don't have much of a heart to give to my children, my sons. How do we change? How do we exorcise those demons? And the answer is we don't, and we won't, if left to our own. Because to get to that place means that we men have got to be willing to sit with the pain and to investigate the wounds, to deal with the brokenness in our own souls, and what men want to do that? Unless we are forced to deal with our demons, to move outward from outward achievement, to move away from the accumulation of titles and possessions and trophies, to step back from that and to move instead into inward focus, to work towards heart transformation, to put down our spears, to put down our briefcases and deal with our neglected hearts and the pain and the fears and the wounds and the insecurities that have accumulated there. That is our work as men. If you have not read Roar, I would recommend to you this book. It's called Adam's Return. It deals with, he studied rites of male initiation across the world and how men don't grow up well by ourselves. In a lot of cultures, there are ways that help us, initiate us, to take steps and to lead us into being leaders that are well acquainted with brokenness and depression and fear. Another book of his that I love is Falling Upward. If you're looking for resources as a man, I've found Richard Rohr to be very accessible to men and thinking about spirituality in ways that make sense. Peggy Orenstein, if maybe some of you read this, she wrote an excellent article recently in The Atlantic. I've actually got copies of it right over there on that music stand if you want to grab one on the way out. Orenstein, a number of years ago, interviewed girls across the United States to write about kind of the female ego and what forms girls in our country. And in that book, she showed how American girls are taught from a very young age to be disconnected from their bodies, to have bad relationships with their bodies. But then as she moved to talking to hundreds and hundreds of young men and boys across the country, she found that boys learn from a young age how to disconnect themselves from their hearts, which deeply affects how and if they can ever enter into vulnerable and intimate relationships with others. There are a lot of lonely boys out there that become lonely men. Boys grow up, she said, with really the only emotions that are validated being happiness or anger. The whole plethora, the whole bucket of emotions like sadness or fear, insecurity or betrayal or despair, all of those things simply get funneled into anger. And so that's how men express themselves, either externally or internally, which is also tragic. We've talked about this before, but for white men of my age, the second leading cause of death in our nation is suicide. We men don't know how to deal with that darkness and that pain and those insecurities and those wounds. We American men know how to be tough, but we don't know how to be weak. And just like it killed Saul, it is literally killing us, and it's killing our relationships. It's killing our ability to lead and provide the presence and the nurture and the strength and the heart that our communities need, that our society needs, that our families need, that we need, and that God longs for. I think another way to view Saul in his journey and his relationship with David, if we were to rewrite this story and how it could have perhaps gone, and how it could have led to Saul being a better and wiser leader and king. I wonder if rather than visiting Saul with an evil spirit, God instead visited Saul with a challenge for him as he has grown into manhood to deal with his basic insecurities and his fears, to take the mistakes that he had made to that point, and to deal with them, to sit with them, and to allow the pain and the problems and the insecurities to be transformed, to make him a better and more broken and beautiful leader. One of my favorite Rohr quotes, however, is that most of the time, if we don't transform our pain, we are destined to transmit it. Hurt people hurt people. And too many of us men have transmitted our pain and hurt others because we haven't had the courage or the tools or the know-how to sit with our deep darkness and pain. It seems to me that God gave Saul a chance to reacquaint himself with the heart that God had given him, that heart full of passion and pain, empathy and love. But that kind of heart, as you grow into a man, only remains as we allow ourselves to sit in our pain, to deal with our depression and our brokenness, sitting with that troubled spirit that each one of us inevitably come face to face with, and get reacquainted with our hearts and with our God in the midst of our pain and our fears. But in a way that doesn't isolate us, but lets others in. God brought David to be with Saul in the midst of his depression and his fear and his anger, to play the harp for him, to ease his soul. I wonder if the plan might have been for David and Saul to become friends, to talk openly about their insecurities and their fear and their pain. And so the depression and the woundedness that Saul was dealing with didn't end up with him picking up spears and throwing them at people, but instead of taking David's hand and having a conversation and sharing their pain and their struggles together. But that's not the route that Saul chose. My brothers, God is looking for men after God's own heart, and God sends into our lives people who can play a harp for us and be with us as we deal with our pain and our woundedness so that it can be transformed. We need to stop striving for all of the trophies, the titles, the promotions, and practice instead being weak. Practice not having the answers. Practice saying sorry. Practice asking for help. Practice opening our hearts to God and to ourselves and to others. Because inside every man, especially those of us who present like we are head and shoulders above, inside every man is an insecure little boy hiding among the supplies, not knowing what to do with his insecurities and his fears. And inside every man there is a servant leader, creative and brave and loving and generous and empathetic. This is the man that God is calling us to be. My brothers, this is the work that God has for us. May we be brave enough to stop being strong and help God to help us to be weak and to grow in our lives and in our relationships a heart that is more like God's. May it be so in us, because friends, our families, our children, our neighborhoods, our world desperately need men after God's own heart. David, as I said, made a lot of mistakes, but one of the things that he did is I think he kept his heart open. Some of the psalms that he wrote were psalms of repentance and brokenness, admitting his sin. He was certainly a jerk, and he made a lot of mistakes. But what he took from all of that, he made into poetry, into songs. And so, as I said, the songs that we are singing this morning, the hymns we are singing this morning, are from David's pen. As a response, as our desire to be people, men after God's own heart, I invite you to stand as we sing hymn 329 together. A hymn that speaks not of brute strength, but of God's strength, which is different. A strength that allows us to be weak as God's love flows in and through us.